This is
Thank you
nice.
so much for taking the time out of your day to do this.
No, this is great. Whenever like young people have questions about the process, we always say yes. It's probably my favorite thing is to engage with young people and like get them excited and let them know there are folks that, care. I don't know.
Right? We actually do care. We're doing something
Trying.
for this, right? Absolutely. Okay, here we go. I guess the first question is, why did you think that this year, this supplemental budget year, was the year to put this bill forward?
So often with supplemental budget years, people really do cost assessments on bills because it's the second year of the biennium. And so if you have a bill that costs a ton of money, that can run into problems. The great thing about this bill is it doesn't cost any money. And in fact, it actually has the potential to save the state a ton of money because we often are who ends up cleaning up what happens when environmental polluters, big polluters, commit crimes. And so I think not only is it not something that would get caught up in that budget conversation, but it has the potential to provide budget relief. So it felt like a really good policy for a short session.
Another question was kind of about the bill process and essentially, how does your advocacy change as the bill makes its way through the process?
Sure. So with this bill, it's not subject to a fiscal committee, which is part of, as I mentioned earlier, it made it a good bill for a 60-day session because often bills will have to stop at multiple points before getting to the floor. And when there's not a lot of time and capacity, that gets caught up. So for me, it came out of the Environment, Energy, Technology Committee, went straight to rules, came to the floor. So my process was then to reach out to colleagues across the aisle and try to get them to, understand and figure out what their concerns were. And you'll see that the bill came out bipartisan. There were still some no votes, and I'm happy to talk more about why I think that is. But so my role now that the bill is off the floor is to then advocate for it to have a hearing in the House where it has to go through the exact same process. So now my amazing staff folks are helping to write bill hearing requests. And then we'll start that advocacy journey exactly like it was in the Senate, but in the opposite chamber.
Excellent. And I know that some of the students did watch a little bit of the floor, coverage. And so then a question would be about some of the amendments that were raised on the floor and process wise, like, were you aware that those were coming? I think they want to know. And then if you were aware, how do you prepare to kind of respond to amendments like that?
Yeah, sometimes we don't know because you can put an amendment on the bar as any time before the bill comes up. So unlike in committee hearings where you have to have a 24-hour posted rule, you don't have to have that. But I was grateful that Senator McEwen, who offered the amendment and who sits on the ENET committee, did let me know the amendment was coming. So I was able to do some work and try to, substantively respond to what I think he was trying to capture. Ultimately, I still said, I asked to reject the amendment. To his credit, he still voted yes on the bill. And so I appreciate that. It was without recommendation in committee. So I think our conversations, again, those conversations go a long way when you try and have trust with your colleagues, even if you don't always agree on the policy, because then they can come to you and you can have a real discussion and figure out whether it's what the impact might be. Because if it's something that I think wouldn't harm the policy, absolutely. Like, I'd love to take an amendment that gets more votes on the floor. But
Sure.
this one didn't quite capture, I think, what the intent was.
Mhm.
And so, I asked for the floor to reject the amendment.
Right, ultimately. Okay. So you would say that most of the time on the floor you are aware of an amendment coming, but sometimes, just in general. Mhm.
Yeah, and I think it depends on the level of controversy and the distance between the two, Democrats and Republicans. So if it's something that folks, a statement that they want to make, or they feel really strongly against the policy, that often will be more surprise amendments. I think for the most part, we generally try to let each other know and keep each other in the fold, but you will see it happen more on bills that tend to be a lot hotter politically
Sure.
among people.
Awesome. Thank you. I think the kind of the last set of questions have to do with the bill itself, and the students specifically at Ording High School, had some questions just about restitution in general and how that works within the bill. And I'll just kind of read off kind of what they were. Essentially, how would the restitution be determined? Is that, individual? Could restitution apply for accidents as well as deliberate acts? And I think that they were kind of talking about that on the floor too, these like accidents potentially. And then is this bill applying to companies or only, or just or individuals itself? So kind of the specific questions.
So the bill is around 3 criminal statutes as they relate to the environment. So it's the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, and I believe it's the Toxic Control Act. So these are very specific statutes that deal with environmental crimes. Restitution as a concept only occurs after a conviction has happened. So they have to meet all of the burden, the state, should they bring a case against someone, just like you would imagine in a law and order criminal court, right? The state has the burden to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that these crimes were committed and that the entity or the individual committed that crime. So you have to go through that entire process, just like you would in a regular criminal court, and then restitution applies. So in a regular criminal court, the judge can look at what is the way to make the victim in the case whole, because often the criminal penalty isn't always the access to justice, right? There may be economic damages, there may be other things in supporting the family, or so there are lots of things that that judges can take a look at in criminal cases. We did not have that same statutory authority under these 3 statutes. And I think it's significant because a lot of the large polluters, particularly entities, it can have, at least in my area of the woods, write off the criminal penalties as the cost of doing business. We're talking about multi-million-dollar, sometimes billion-dollar companies that really have the ability to pay a $20,000 fine or $25,000 fine as if, great, okay, I'll pay the $25,000 because maybe as they analyze the cost versus the benefit, it makes sense. And so really giving judges the ability to capture the whole cost. And I'll give an example. In Tacoma, there were 2 boat fires. The company was found to be negligent in the first boat fire, didn't do anything to resolve the issues, led to a second boat fire. In that case, the fire department had to come up with a very specific response that caused a lot of resources to be used. The city had a stay-at-place order. Other businesses had to stop operations. So when you think about the impact on a broader community scale, restitution allows you to do that and say, okay, the local government had to incur this amount of cost. Maybe that's something we should look at. And it forces the person that's committing the crime to then really have a second thought about whether they're going to continue to do that, because they could potentially be on the hook for all of these other pieces. But I think even beyond that, environmental harm is a generational impact. So the state sometimes for decades will pay to remediate or to clean up things. Sometimes we've just committed to probably remediating forever. But it's not fair to young people. And I really appreciate that it's young people that are asking these questions, because it's not fair, I think, to say, oh, capture this one moment in time in a case that has potentially, impacts that are going to last a really long time. So even if it's a deterrent or the opportunity to take a look at the whole picture, I think we owe it to the next generations to do that.
Yeah, thank you. I think that they'll appreciate that and hear kind of the call to action and just the really understanding kind of the nuances of the bill, right? As they're high school students, and there's some, legal things that they're not quite as familiar with, hopefully, right? But they're not as familiar with the criminal justice system.
Well, they're asking some good questions. I mean,
yeah.
They're questions that I'll say the legislators are even asking, because there are many folks I noticed on the ENET committee. Restitution is something like on the Law and Justice Committee we talk about all the time. It's very familiar, understand it. And in some ways, the fact that we impose so heavily restitution on folks that sometimes don't even have the ability to pay that restitution, but then we're unwilling to do it for companies that have such a wide impact, feels fundamentally unfair. So I think in the ENET committee, I reckon I'm like, oh, people don't know about restitution because it's not something that's commonly talked about outside of the legal.
Right.
Universe. So I can appreciate the zone, why they're asking them. It's the same ones I'm getting from colleagues. They should know
Well,
that.
good, and hopefully they'll, yeah, have the clarity there. I think our final question is just, do you think the bill is going to pass through the House? Like, do you have good feelings about its future?
I do. I think that this is a bill that's supported strongly by Democrats. I think when you see the vote, it does have Republican votes. I think people understand the value of something like this. So I don't see why there would be any issues getting it through the House. No, that doesn't mean that I rely on good policy to make it through. It means I still have more work to do to talk to all of my colleagues over there. But I have really good relationships with members in the Environment Committee and other committee members. So I feel good about it. I think we get this done this year.
Well, again, thank you so much for taking your time today for, I know that you're
Oh,
busy, but it's probably also nice to sit down for a moment and
it is nice to sit down for a minute. And like I said, like anything that communicates out and like gets like young people excited about this process, like it serves me as much as I hope it will serve them. So thank you.
great. Thank you, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.